My childhood bully started dating my mom just weeks after my dad's death. He manipulated her into thinking I never cared about her and changed her will to only include himself. I drove back to my childhood home for the first time in 8 years, my hands shaking as I pulled into the driveway where my father would never again wave from the porch. The house looked better than it had in decades, with fresh paint, new gutters, and a garden that actually had flowers instead of weeds. That's when I saw him through the kitchen window, standing next to my grieving mother with his arm around her shoulder like he belonged there, like he was the son who'd never left her side. It was my high school bully, Christopher. He was in my kitchen making my mother laugh while she cooked dinner. My stomach dropped as memories flooded back of lockers slammed shut on my fingers and hallways where I'd learned to walk with my head down. I sat in my car for 10 minutes trying to process what I was seeing before finally walking to the front door. Mom opened it before I could knock, and her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since before Dad died 3 months ago. She looked healthier somehow and was wearing actual makeup instead of the pajamas she'd been living in during our video calls. Christopher appeared behind her, wiping his hands on a dish towel like he lived there. He smiled at me and extended his hand. "I'm Christopher, but everyone calls me Chris. You must be Danny. Your mom talks about you all the time." His grip was chattering about how wonderful Chris had been helping with everything from grocery shopping to fixing the leaky faucet Dad never got around to. She kept touching his arm when she talked about him and looking at him like he'd saved her life. During dinner, Chris asked about my graphic design work in Portland and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. He mentioned staying local after graduation and how he'd always believed in taking care of family and community. Mom nodded along enthusiastically, and I caught her glancing between us like she was comparing. Chris helped clear the table without being asked and knew exactly where everything went in the kitchen. He had his own coffee mug with his name on it, and there were photos of him with Mom on the refrigerator that... Chris leaned back in his chair and said, "Funny how life works out, isn't it? Small towns have a way of bringing people back together when they need each other most." I asked how long he'd been helping Mom, and he said he'd started coming around right after the funeral when he heard she was struggling. He just wanted to check on her since he remembered how kind she'd always been to everyone at school. The way he said it made it sound like a beautiful coincidence, but something felt calculated about his timing. After dessert, Chris mentioned he should head home, but Mom insisted he stay for coffee. She seemed almost panicked at the thought of him leaving, and I realized she'd grown dependent on his presence in a way that went beyond simple gratitude. Mom walked him to the door and hugged him goodbye. She came back inside glowing and immediately started praising him, saying, "He's been such a blessing, Danny. I don't know what I would have done without him these past few months. He's so mature and responsible, and he never makes me feel like a burden the way some people do." The emphasis on "some people do" hit like a physical blow. I tried to explain that I'd been dealing with Dad's death too, and that my job required me to be in Portland, but Mom just shook her head. That night, I was laying on the couch since Chris had converted my old bedroom into what Mom called his workshop. I could hear Mom on the phone with someone, talking about how worried she was about me and how... The next morning, Chris showed up at 7:30 with coffee and pastries from Mom's favorite bakery. He knew her order by heart. Over breakfast, he mentioned projects he was planning for the house and spoke about the future like he'd be part of it permanently. Mom hung on his every word and agreed to everything he suggested. When I tried to join the conversation, Chris would redirect to something I couldn't contribute to, like local politics or people from high school I'd never kept in touch with. He had a way of making me feel like an outsider in my own family home. Later that day, while Mom was at the grocery store, Chris cornered me in the garage. He dropped his friendly mask completely and looked at me with those same cold eyes from senior year. She needed a son who actually cared enough to stick around, and the only son who deserves her inheritance. Then Mom's car pulled up, and his warm smile returned instantly as he went to help her with the groceries. That evening, Mom announced she was updating her will to include Chris because family isn't just blood, it's who shows up for you. She looked directly at me when she said it, and I realized Chris had been positioning himself as my replacement from the moment he'd learned Dad died. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through everything that had happened. The couch springs creaked as I shifted, trying to process how Chris had infiltrated our lives so completely. My phone buzzed with a text from Carol asking if I'd... The next morning, I woke to Chris's voice in the kitchen. He was already there at 6003 making breakfast and discussing plans for converting the garage into a home gym. Carol agreed to everything while I watched from the doorway, invisible to both of them. When I cleared my throat, Chris turned with that practiced smile and offered me coffee from my own father's favorite mug. I spent the morning trying to help around the house, but Chris had already handled everything. The gutters were cleaned, the lawn was mowed, even the attic was reorganized. Every task I suggested was met with Carol explaining how Chris had already taken care of it last week, last month, or was planning to do it tomorrow. My offers felt redundant, unwanted, but Carol touched Chris's arm and asked if he could stay to help her with something in the kitchen. I volunteered to help Mrs. Patterson instead, partly to be useful and partly to escape the suffocating dynamic in my childhood home. The paperwork took 4 hours. Mrs. Patterson's dining table was covered in insurance forms, hospital bills, and Medicare statements. She kept apologizing for taking up my time, but I was grateful for the distraction. Her hands shook as she showed me bill after bill, and I helped her organize everything into a system that made sense. She mentioned how helpful Chris had been after her husband's funeral, bringing groceries and checking on her. Even here, his influence reached. When I could see Chris installing something on the wall. The kitchen faucet was in pieces on the counter, and Chris was explaining how he'd noticed it was about to break completely. He'd already ordered the replacement parts and would have it fixed by evening. I offered to help with the faucet since I'd watched Dad fix it dozens of times over the years. Carol just patted my arm and said Chris had it handled. She trusted him with these things now. My knowledge of our house, accumulated over decades, was worthless compared to his 4 months of calculated helpfulness. That evening, I mentioned something about high school while Carol was in the bathroom. Just a casual comment about the old football field being turned into a parking lot. Chris's whole body tensed. Carol rushed back at the sound of his gasping breaths, immediately cradling his head and glaring at me. She soothed him while scolding me for bringing up what were clearly painful memories. Chris leaned into her comfort, but I caught a flash of calculation in his eyes before they closed. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Lily, Carol's 8-year-old granddaughter from her sister Janet, bounded through the door and went straight to Chris. She wrapped her arms around his waist and called him Uncle Chris like they'd known each other forever. Carol beamed at the sight while my stomach churned. When had this relationship formed? How many family moments had I missed? Lily chattered about her week at school and showed Chris her drawings. He listened with apparent genuine interest. She tilted her head and asked if I was the uncle who lived far away, the uncle who was too busy to visit. Chris had clearly been present for enough family gatherings to become the familiar face while I remained the stranger. Later, while Carol and Lily baked cookies, I found myself drawn to Chris's workshop. My old bedroom had been transformed completely. The walls held tools I didn't recognize, projects in various stages of completion. On the workbench sat my old high school yearbook, bookmarked with sticky notes. I moved closer, curious about what had caught his attention. The door burst open, and Lily stood there, flower in her hair and chocolate on her fingers. She looked between me and the yearbook with wide eye, heavy with disappointment. The confrontation was brief, but devastating. Carol stood in the doorway of what used to be my room, shaking her head. She reminded me about boundaries and respect for privacy. Chris appeared behind her, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. He said nothing, but his presence spoke volumes. I was the intruder here, violating the sanctity of his space in what used to be my home. That weekend, Dr. Martinez called the house. Carol's grief counselor needed a character reference for Chris, who had volunteered to help with other grieving families in the community. Carol practically glowed as she described Chris's compassion and dedication. She handed him the phone with such pride, like a mother watching. The sleep deprivation from the uncomfortable couch made me irritable. I snapped at small things, paced the house at odd hours, and probably looked exactly like the unstable son Chris had been describing. Carol started watching me with concern, the same expression she'd worn during Dad's cancer diagnosis when I'd struggled to cope. The family group text for planning Dad's memorial service became a minefield. Every suggestion I made was screenshotted by Chris and reframed in his responses. When I proposed having the service at Dad's favorite restaurant, Chris pointed out how that would exclude elderly family members who couldn't handle the noise. When I suggested a specific date, Chris had already checked with everyone, and her voice carrying from the kitchen where Carol had her on speaker. Janet was concerned about my behavior, specifically my obsessive questions about Chris. Apparently, Chris had mentioned to Janet's husband during golf that I seemed fixated on their friendship in an unhealthy way. Carol assured her sister that Chris was handling the situation with grace despite my jealousy. The next morning brought another revelation. Chris had inherited Dad's golf club membership and his complete workshop tool collection. Carol explained that Dad would have wanted them to go to someone who would actually use them, someone who was here, who understood their value. The monthly dues were still being automatically deducted from Dad's account, now funding Chris's Sunday morning rounds. One morning, after another sleepless night on the couch, I nearly crashed my car in the school parking lot. My reflexes were shot, and I veered too close to a parked car before correcting. Several parents witnessed the near miss, and by evening, Carol had heard about it through the neighborhood network. Chris suggested gently that maybe I should let him drive me places while I was visiting, for everyone's safety. Maria, Carol's best friend since college, stopped coming around. When I asked Carol about it, she sighed and explained that Maria's husband had given her an ultimatum about getting involved in family drama. Maria had called Carol privately, crying, saying she believed there were two sides to every story. The neighborhood Facebook group became another battlefield I didn't even know existed. Carol showed me her phone one evening, scrolling through a discussion about supporting each other through grief. 47 comments expressed concern about my behavior, my apparent inability to accept Carol's healing process, and praise for Chris's stabilizing presence. People I'd known since childhood were discussing my mental state like I was a problem to be solved. One afternoon, while Chris was at work, Carol mentioned something about security footage from the grocery store. She was trying to remember when she'd first run into Chris after the funeral, and the timestamp from the store's cameras had helped her piece together those foggy early days of grief. Chris's story about randomly making my suspicions look like paranoid delusions. The revelation about how Chris had found us came from an unexpected source. My old college roommate called, guilty and apologetic. Months ago, Chris had reached out about planning a high school reunion. He'd been tracking down contact information for everyone, especially those who'd moved away. My roommate had given him my details, including my parents' address, thinking he was helping organize something nice. The reunion never materialized, but Chris had gotten what he needed. When I tried to use this information to show Carol how calculated Chris's arrival was, it backfired spectacularly. The fact that I'd never RSVP'd to any reunion planning made me look antisocial and disconnected from my hometown. My vindication became another mark against me. The mailman witnessed my moment of triumph when I thought I'd found proof of Chris's deception. I discovered a discrepancy in some dates Chris had mentioned, and my relief was visible as I stood in the driveway, actually smiling for the first time in days. The mailman, who'd known our family for 20 years, later mentioned to Carol how strange it was to see me celebrating while she was still grieving. Even my small victories were turned into evidence of my callousness. By the end of that second week, the battle lines were clear. Chris and I both understood that this was a zero-sum game. There wasn't room for both of us in Carol's life, not with the narrative he'd constructed. One of us would have to be complete by Carol, who needed Chris's support to function. The only question was whether I could save her from what was coming or if I'd lose her completely in the trying. I sat in my rental car that night, parked down the street from my childhood home. Through the windows, I could see Chris and Carol moving around the kitchen, cooking dinner together in perfect synchronization. They looked like a mother and son who'd spent a lifetime building those rhythms. I looked like the outsider I'd become, sitting in the dark, watching the life that used to be mine. Chris started volunteering at Carol's church grief support group the following week. I watched from the parking lot as he carried boxes of tissues and coffee supplies through the side entrance, greeting other volunteers with warm handshakes. Within days, he'd known. The church secretary later mentioned to Carol how Chris quoted Dad's favorite Bible verse during a particularly moving session, bringing comfort to a newly widowed woman. Carol's eyes filled with tears of pride when she heard this, while I sat there knowing Chris had found that verse highlighted in Dad's old Bible that now sat on his nightstand. The confrontation happened Tuesday evening when Carol was at her book club. Chris and I crossed paths in the hallway, and I finally voiced my suspicions directly. His face transformed from concern to rage, then back to calm calculation within seconds. By the time Carol returned home, we'd both given our versions of events. I described his threats and intimidation. Chris tearfully explained, choosing comfort over investigation. My phone held evidence I'd been collecting, including screenshots of my old texts to Dad. The messages showed me complaining about family obligations, postponing visits, and prioritizing work over time with him. Chris had somehow accessed these and was now using them in his narrative about my neglect. Each message became ammunition in his campaign to prove I'd never really cared about the family I was now trying to protect. Lily's weekend visits became particularly painful. She'd developed a habit of asking innocent questions that cut deep. During lunch, she wondered aloud why I hadn't visited Grandpa when he was sick, repeating almost verbatim the accusation, but the damage was already done. The Ring doorbell camera captured everything. One evening, overwhelmed by the situation, I paced the driveway arguing with myself, trying to work through my options out loud. The footage made me look unstable, talking to no one, gesturing wildly. Chris made sure Carol saw it the next day, expressing concern about my mental state. The irony wasn't lost on me that the security system meant to protect the house was now being used to build a case against me. Chris filed for a restraining order the following Monday. The family court mediator treated my concerns as inappropriate boundary violations, especially after Chris presented evidence of my harassment. The temp, like I was the dangerous one who needed supervision. Dad's old laptop became my lifeline. I remembered his password from years of helping him with technology issues. Late at night in my motel room, I discovered Chris had been corresponding as Carol's family representative with various organizations. Dad's auto-signature still appeared at the bottom of emails Chris was sending about estate matters. The calculated precision of his communications revealed someone who'd been planning this for months. The emails showed Chris's careful responses to probate court inquiries about family dynamics. He painted himself as the devoted surrogate son who'd stepped up during a time of need, while I was portrayed as the absent child who only Chen, my therapist from Portland, was subpoenaed to provide testimony about my mental state. During a brief phone consultation, she was forced to confirm that I'd struggled with Dad's death and had expressed difficulty with family changes. Her clinical language about grief processing and adjustment disorders was twisted into evidence of instability. Professional confidentiality meant she couldn't provide context that might have helped. My attempt to record Chris failed spectacularly. During a brief encounter at the grocery store, I tried to capture his threats on my phone. He spotted the recording notification immediately and loudly announced I was illegally surveilling him. When the store manager approached, When Chris volunteered to collect Lily after I'd had what he termed an emotional outburst at the house, it established him as the stable family figure. The school added him to the authorized pickup list while expressing concerns about my erratic behavior. Each small victory for Chris meant another door closing for me. Mrs. Patterson's betrayal hurt particularly deep. After an anonymous complaint about her late property taxes threatened her home, she chose to stay in Chris's good graces rather than support my version of events. She stopped answering my calls and would hurry inside when she saw me approaching. Her whispered apology through the door included the words I'd hear repeated, "I can't risk losing my home." One night, I discovered the intimacy of the moment. The calculated way he'd inserted himself into even these private spaces made me physically ill. When I mentioned it to Carol, she defended it as Chris honoring Dad's memory by keeping his spirit alive in the house. Chris's offer came through Carol, though I knew he'd orchestrated it. If I stopped harassing the family, he would let me say goodbye to Dad's things properly before the estate sale. The implication was clear: continued resistance would mean losing access to even these final memories. When I refused, Carol interpreted it as caring more about objects than Lily's emotional stability, another mark against my character. The grocery store receipt changed, and this contradicted his story about randomly encountering Carol weeks later. But this discovery, which should have vindicated me, only proved Chris had been thoughtful enough to reach out immediately. My suspicious interpretation looked like paranoid jealousy. Dad's work computer at the plant held crucial information. Both Chris and I realized Dad had been documenting concerns about the house and Carol's isolation, but accessing it required different approaches. While I tried to go through proper channels, Chris used Carol's grief to gain authorization. By the time I arrived, the files had been reviewed and interpreted through Chris's lens. The documents revealed Dad's notes asking Chris to help Carol, painting Chris as the dutiful executor of Dad's final requests, while I appeared to be selfishly fighting against Dad's own plans. Janet faced an impossible choice. Carol's sister could see the truth in my concerns, but risked losing access to Lily if she supported me. During a tearful phone call, she admitted she couldn't lose her granddaughter too. Family loyalty meant nothing when weighed against Chris's growing control over Carol's decisions. Janet chose silence, another ally neutralized. My investigation tactics grew desperate. I started manipulating Carol's church friends, using guilt trips and emotional appeals to gather information about Chris. Each conversation left me feeling more like I photographed personnel files while making small talk about grief, hating myself for the deception. Dad's shared cloud account contained evidence before Chris realized it existed. The files showed Dad's growing concerns about Carol's isolation and vulnerability. But obtaining this information required violating password protections and privacy expectations. Every piece of evidence I gathered came tainted with ethical compromises that undermined its value. Uncle Robert arrived from out of state with his own agenda. Dad's brother wanted the workshop tools and demanded real family control over the estate. Fighting a war on two fronts meant missing Lily's school. My credit cards maxed out from lawyer consultation fees, while Chris had full access to Carol's accounts for household management. The financial disparity affected everything from my ability to gather evidence to my basic daily needs. Living in an extended-stay motel while Chris occupied my childhood room created a visual narrative of belonging versus intrusion. The confrontation at Dad's favorite diner traumatized the waitress who'd known our family for decades. My desperate attempt to explain the situation in public made me look unhinged. She called Carol afterward, concerned about my behavior. Another community member added to the growing chorus of people worried about my mental state rather than Chris's manipulation. The replacement designer, I later learned, was Chris's former coworker. Even my professional life became contaminated by his influence. Carol's plea broke something inside me. She begged me to let Dad rest in peace instead of making his death about my jealousy. Her tears were genuine, her pain real. I was torturing her during the worst time of her life, regardless of my intentions. Chris stood behind her, offering silent support, the son she needed while I'd become the source of additional grief. The church secretary's marriage strained under the weight of my investigation. Questions about her sharing information with me led to arguments with her husband. Her disabled son asked why people were angry at Mommy, adding guilt to my growing collection of collateral damage. Chin asked the question that haunted me during our final session. What if Chris genuinely loved Carol and I was sabotaging her happiness? My inability to immediately answer revealed the doubt creeping into my certainty. The possibility that I might be wrong, that my actions were causing unnecessary pain, became another weight to carry. Standing before the church congregation, I publicly admitted my failures as a son. The confession was strategic, meant to maintain credibility about present concerns, but the words were true. I had prioritized work over family, missed important moments, taken Dad's presence for granted. Chris sat in the front row, nodding sympathetically, playing the forgiving brother to perfection, proof that I'd chosen personal pleasure over what became my last chance to hear his voice. Chris somehow knew this detail and used it in his narrative about my priorities. Chris's lawyer filed an emergency motion, advancing the probate hearing by months. My lawyer was attending his daughter's wedding, leaving me scrambling for representation. The accelerated timeline favored Chris's position as the stable, present family member over my chaotic attempts at intervention. Legal momentum shifted decisively in his direction. During a moment of unexpected vulnerability, Chris revealed his true motivations. He'd grown up with an abusive father, always envying the family I'd taken for granted. His desire to become Carol's saving Carol required becoming someone I didn't recognize. I manipulated Lily's trust during a family dinner, using her innocent affection to access Chris's phone. The betrayal of a child's confidence marked a new low in my transformation from protective son to calculated strategist. Each victory came at the cost of another piece of my identity. Chris's tears at Dad's grave were genuine. I watched from a distance as he knelt by the headstone, shoulders shaking with real grief. We were both crying for the same loss, both seeking to fill the same void. The shared pain made our conflict more tragic. Two damaged people destroying each other over the love of one grieving woman. The minor legal, his integration into the family's daily life mattered more than any document I could produce. Everything depended on Carol's testimony about her wishes for the future. Both Chris and I knew the final decision rested with her, not the courts. The woman who'd raised me, who'd loved me unconditionally, would have to choose between the son she'd born and the son she'd chosen. The weight of that choice was destroying her as much as our conflict. Chris's young nephew became an unwitting weapon. The child's innocent question about why I was being mean to Uncle Chris cut deeper than any legal argument. Children's voices carried moral weight that adult accusations couldn't match. Chris had built relationships with extended family while I'd run. Those who'd experienced caregiver burnout sympathized with Chris. Those who'd dealt with family manipulation saw my perspective. The office dynamics shifted as personal drama infected professional relationships. Carol's stress affected her work performance, adding another layer of consequence. The family court system wasn't designed for cases like ours. Custody disputes had clear frameworks, but emotional manipulation without physical harm fell into gray areas. The legal tools available didn't match the psychological complexity of Chris's campaign. I discovered that being right didn't guarantee justice within institutional limitations. Dad's professional contacts provided limited help. The social capital Dad had built over a lifetime offered sympathy but not substantial support. The revelation about Dad's prior knowledge reframed everything. He'd known Chris was struggling financially and had planned to help him find work. Dad's kindness had opened the door. Chris eventually walked through. The tragedy wasn't just manipulation, but the exploitation of genuine compassion. Dad's good intentions had created the vulnerability Chris exploited. The help Dad had planned for Chris became clearer through his former supervisor at the plant. Tom McTheodore pulled me aside after I'd spent hours searching through Dad's work emails. He explained how Dad had noticed Chris hanging around the hardware store looking down. The kindness that defined my father had inadvertently created the opening Chris exploited. Dad's compassion reframed the tragedy without excusing Chris's actions. The work emails I finally accessed showed Dad's growing concern about Chris's intensity around Carol. One message to Tom described Chris asking detailed questions about Carol's daily routine, her favorite foods, her medical condition. Dad had written about feeling uneasy but choosing to believe Chris simply cared about helping. The timestamp showed this email was sent 2 weeks before Dad's death. I sat in the plant's break room, studying printouts of Dad's correspondence. Each page revealed another piece of Chris's calculated approach. The evidence painted a picture of exploitation wrapped in genuine need. Chris hadn't lied about struggling, he'd simply weaponized his circumstances. The cost of obtaining this evidence weighed heavily. I'd violated Dad's privacy, reading his fears about dying, his worries about leaving Carol alone. One email to Tom mentioned nightmares about Carol being taken advantage of after he was gone. Dad had seen the danger but chosen hope over suspicion. His final act of trust had become Chris's greatest weapon. I drove to the courthouse with the evidence organized chronologically. The security guard recognized me from previous visits, his expression mixing pity with wariness. I'd become a familiar. The probate clerk's office smelled like old paper and disappointment. I submitted my formal request to review Chris's filings, knowing the process would take days. The clerk, a woman who'd processed my parents' marriage license decades ago, avoided eye contact as she stamped the forms. Even here, Chris's narrative about my instability had taken root. While waiting for document access, I discovered Chris's critical mistake. His notarized statement about first meeting Carol contained specific dates that contradicted the grocery store receipts I'd found. The timeline discrepancy was small but undeniable. Chris had claimed their first post-funeral encounter happened 3 weeks after Dad's death, but the sympathy card receipt proved Carol's trust in me had eroded beyond simple repair. Chris's lies could be proved, but the relationships he built remained real. The community had embraced him as Carol's savior while viewing me as the disruptive son who'd abandoned her. Truth and perception had diverged beyond reconciliation. I spent the night before the hearing in my motel room, organizing evidence into a presentation that focused on facts rather than accusations. Each document received a simple label explaining its significance. The goal was proving deception without attacking Chris's character, showing the court patterns of manipulation while acknowledging his genuine struggles. Dad would have wanted compassion, even now. The morning of the hearing arrived with unexpected, each one requiring conscious effort. Inside, the hallway filled with familiar faces choosing sides through their seating arrangements. Church friends, neighbors, and extended family created an inadvertent map of allegiances. Carol arrived with Chris. Their synchronized movements showed months of practiced routine. She wore the black dress from Dad's funeral, a choice that felt deliberately symbolic. Chris guided her with a protective hand on her elbow, whispering what appeared to be reassurances. They sat in the front row, surrounded by supporters who glared at me with protective hostility. The judge entered precisely at 9:00, her expression revealing nothing about preliminary reviews. I recognized establishing ground rules that emphasized factual presentation over emotional appeals. The framework favored documentation over narrative, a small advantage for my prepared evidence. Chris's lawyer presented first, painting a picture of devoted caregiving and family dysfunction. The narrative felt rehearsed but effective, each point supported by witness statements and behavioral documentation. Chris sat quietly throughout, occasionally reaching over to pat Carol's hand. His performance of concerned son was flawless, years of studying our family paying off in subtle gestures. My turn came with the documentary evidence. I presented the timeline discrepancies methodically, showing how Chris's sworn. The judge studied each document carefully, asking clarifying questions that revealed she understood the implications. The room's atmosphere shifted as patterns emerged. Chris's carefully constructed timeline unraveled through receipts and timestamps. Several supporters began whispering, comparing what they'd been told with what documents proved. The collective realization spread slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape of deception. Even Carol's expression showed cracks of doubt. Chris's composure finally broke during the presentation of Dad's work emails. As I read Dad's concerns about Chris's intensity, his questions about Carol's finances, his documentation of suspicious behavior, Chris began breathing rapidly. But this time, the context had changed. The judge called for a recess, during which Chris's nephew's mother approached me in the hallway. She explained how Chris had been asking her son to call him uncle and discussing joining their family permanently. Her protective instincts had activated, recognizing patterns from Chris's past relationships. She agreed to testify about his history of attaching to vulnerable families. When proceedings resumed, Chris's psychological state became the focus. His lawyer attempted damage control, but Chris himself began speaking rapidly about deserving a real family, about years of watching others have what he'd never received. His words tumbled out in a stream of genuine pain mixed with intolerance. The judge ordered immediate psychological evaluations for all parties involved. The mandate included Chris, Carol, and myself, acknowledging the trauma inflicted on everyone. She specifically noted concerns about Chris's persistent delusional attachment patterns and Carol's vulnerability to manipulation during grief. The clinical language felt both validating and devastating. Chris's breakdown accelerated as consequences materialized. He began sobbing about just wanting a mother who loved him, about being tired of being alone, about deserving the family I'd thrown away. The raw honesty of his pain didn't excuse his actions but explained them. Everyone in the courtroom was grateful for Chris's help, but increasingly uncomfortable with his intensity. She looked at me while describing how my absence had created a void Chris had eagerly filled. The acknowledgement felt like a knife, but her growing awareness of manipulation provided hope. The judge's preliminary ruling established immediate boundaries. Chris was prohibited from unsupervised contact with Carol pending psychological evaluation. Financial oversight was mandated for estate matters. Supervised visitation with Lily was ordered, protecting the child while maintaining family connections. Each restriction felt necessary but tragic, acknowledging Chris as both victim and perpetrator. I was offered the opportunity to influence Chris's treatments, always choosing kindness even when it cost him. I requested comprehensive therapy rather than punitive measures, asking the court to address Chris's underlying trauma rather than just punishing his actions. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Chris's supporters divided between those feeling betrayed and those defending him despite evidence. Carol seemed smaller somehow, realizing how thoroughly she'd been manipulated while grieving. The community that had united against me now fractured along lines of belief and disbelief. Truth had won, but victory felt hollow. Legal protections were established quickly. Carol's accounts required dual authorization. The house title was protected from changes. A social worker was assigned. The practical requirements of protection felt like additional losses. Chris faced supervised treatment at a facility specializing in attachment disorders. His genuine breakdown had convinced the court that punishment without treatment would only perpetuate cycles of harm. He would receive help while being prevented from causing additional damage. The solution felt inadequate but necessary, addressing illness while protecting victims. Carol and I began the slow process of rebuilding through mandated family counseling. The sessions were painful, full of accusations and apologies in equal measure. We sat in uncomfortable chairs discussing how grief had made us vulnerable to different kinds of harm. The church potlucks felt different, with unspoken divisions between those who'd enabled Chris and those who'd seen through him. Some relationships never recovered, trust broken by choosing sides in a conflict that had no true winners. The social fabric of our small town bore permanent tears from the manipulation that had thrived in our midst. 6 months later, I helped Carol sort through Dad's things properly. We worked in companionable silence, occasionally sharing memories or tears. The house felt different now, marked by Chris's absence but also by hard-won awareness. Carol had installed new locks and security cameras, practical reminders of vulnerability. We were both forever changed, warier but he was building genuine therapeutic relationships, learning healthier ways to seek connection. The reports felt hopeful despite everything, suggesting healing was possible even for those who'd caused profound harm. I returned to Portland eventually, but the definition of home had shifted. Regular video calls with Carol replaced the previous distance. We established new patterns of connection born from nearly losing each other entirely. The relationship was different, marked by intentional effort rather than assumed bonds. We'd learned that family required active choice, not just blood or proximity. The financial settlements proceeded slowly but fairly. Chris's claims were dismissed, but he received assistance for treatment costs. The legal resolution felt anticlimactic after months of emotional warfare. simple documents ending complex devastation. Lily struggled to understand why Uncle Chris couldn't visit anymore. Janet and Carol worked together to explain boundaries and safety in age-appropriate ways. The child's confusion reminded everyone that Chris's manipulation had touched even the youngest family members. Healing would take generations, ripple effects of one man's desperate need for belonging. The house stood as testament to everything that had transpired. Chris's workshop became a guest room again, painted neutral colors that erased his presence. The kitchen faucet he'd installed. Carol developed friendships with other widows who understood grief without exploitation. She volunteered at the same support group where Chris had infiltrated her life, using her experience to help others recognize manipulation. Her story became a cautionary tale told gently, warning without condemning those who'd simply tried to help. I learned to forgive myself for the distance that had created opportunity for Chris's manipulation. Therapy helped address the guilt of prioritizing career over family, the regret of missed moments with Dad. The work was ongoing, accepting responsibility while recognizing that Chris's actions were his own choice. Healing meant holding multiple truths simultaneously. The man who tried to steal a family through kindness. Some still defended him, unable to reconcile the helpful neighbor with the calculating manipulator. Truth remained complicated, refusing simple categories of villain and victim. Legal protections remained in place, permanent reminders of temporary vulnerability. Carol's finances stayed secure through oversight that felt both restrictive and necessary. The house's deed included provisions preventing future exploitation. Each safeguard represented lessons learned through profound cost. Security came through accepting that trust required verification. Chris completed treatment and relocated to another state, court orders preventing return. Reports indicated he'd found distance provided safety for everyone involved, allowing healing without continued contact. The final estate matters resolved quietly. Dad's workshop tools went to a vocational school in his memory, helping struggling young people learn trades. His golf membership was sold, proceeds funding Carol's future security. Each decision honored his memory while acknowledging how his possessions had been weaponized. Legacy became about more than objects, focusing on values that couldn't be stolen. Carol found peace in small routines that belonged only to her. Morning coffee on the porch, evening walks with neighbors who'd proven trustworthy, weekly calls with family who'd stood by her. She rebuilt life on her own terms. I visited regularly but maintained healthy boundaries. Our relationship evolved into something new, neither the distant connection of before nor the crisis-forced intensity of the conflict. We were mother and son who'd survived a unique trauma, bonded by experience but respectful of individual healing needs. Love persisted, transformed but unbroken. The story ended not with dramatic justice, but with quiet adaptation. Evil wasn't vanquished, it was treated and relocated. Victims weren't made whole, they learned to live with scars. The community didn't unite in condemnation, it fractured and slowly reformed around new understandings. Reality refused the clean, seeking different things from the same loss. The headstone bore witness to love exploited and trust betrayed, but also to compassion that persisted despite profound harm. In the end, Dad's greatest legacy was teaching us that choosing kindness required wisdom about when and how to extend it. Life continued with new awareness. Carol aged with appropriate support systems, protected but not isolated. I built my own family with hard-won knowledge about boundaries and trust. The town moved forward, carrying lessons about grief's vulnerability and community's responsibility. Chris existed somewhere beyond our borders, hopefully healing rather than seeking new targets. Justice came through understanding rather than punishment. The community learned vigilance without paranoia. Everyone bore scars, but scars could teach if we let them. The ending wasn't happy, but it was real, and in its reality lay the possibility for genuine healing. I represented a mother whose rich sister tried to steal her newborn twins by weaponizing her postpartum depression and selling them for $200,000 to her fertility clinic clients. After I exposed the conspiracy and got her arrested, she orchestrated a harassment campaign from jail, slashing tires, forging emails to get my client fired, filing false CPS reports, and eventually planning to kidnap the twins during a staged panic attack. She got 25 years in prison. I represented a new mother named Gracie, fighting to retain custody of her infant twins after her rich sister engineered an adoption scheme to take the children. Gracie battled postpartum depression following the premature, a calculating pharmaceutical executive residing in an exclusive neighborhood who operated a fertility practice. Arriving at court, flanked by adoption lawyers, she asserted Gracie was psychologically unfit and jeopardizing innocent children. "My sister has displayed instability since adolescence," Gertrude stated without emotion. "During my visits, the infants wailed incessantly due to obvious neglect, and she rejected all assistance. Gracie broke down in my office following the proceedings, barely able to speak. All I requested was assistance with food expenses, never for her to seize my babies," her voice broke. "Without them, I have no reason to continue." Gracie revealed that Gertrude had long harbored resentment, making frequent visits while recording each difficult moment. The evidence appeared overwhelming. Gertrude possessed photographs of disheveled living spaces, audio of infant distress, and statements from fertility clinic employees regarding Gracie's troubling psychological condition. "Describe these visits in detail," I questioned. "Were others present?" Gracie's composure faltered while recounting. Gertrude arrived accompanied by Dr. Morrison from an adoption service, invariably when I was isolated and depleted, photographing everything under the guise of assistance. This information seemed significant. "Was Dr. Morrison ever your actual physician?" "Absolutely not," Gracie replied. Yet Morrison independently, prompting fierce resistance from Gertrude's legal team, though I maintained these professional assessments required verification. Morrison presented as an anxious individual constantly checking her mobile device, visibly unsettled by straightforward inquiries. "These infants require more than an unstable mother can provide," Morrison claimed. "Gertrude simply prioritizes their welfare." Her narrative disintegrated when challenged. She failed to provide legitimate evaluation documents, confirmed she never treated Gracie professionally, and repeatedly mentioned financial arrangements. My investigation into Morrison's organization revealed Gertrude had transferred 50,000 labeled consensus, predating any alleged neglect observations. Confronted with financial records and message histories, Gertrude's facade cracked entirely. She had committed the twins to clients from her fertility practice for $200,000, was embezzling placement fees, and required Gracie deemed incompetent before the scheme unraveled. "You cannot comprehend infertility's anguish," Gertrude shrieked. Gracie received what I was denied. Unknown to her, I'd already contacted the intended adoptive couple, who reacted with horror upon discovering they'd participated in attempted child theft. They'd recorded Gertrude stating, "My sister wishes to surrender them but requires convincing," and willingly provided testimony, and communications where Gertrude called them "my twins-to-be" during Gracie's pregnancy. The judge spoke with trembling fury. "This court has witnessed numerous custody battles, but weaponizing postpartum depression to steal infants constitutes an unconscionable betrayal, and I'm forwarding this case to prosecutors for conspiracy to kidnap, defraud, and traffic human beings." While officers escorted Gertrude away, Gracie held her children and stated softly, "You proved that maternal bonds cannot be purchased, stolen, or counterfeited." Authorities later closed Morrison's operation and prosecuted both conspirators for fraud, while the fertility practice faced extensive litigation. I filed the necessary paperwork to ensure the custody ruling remained ironclad, while Gracie focused on healing and caring for her twins. She moved through her days with newfound confidence, teaching her classes with renewed energy and coming home to children who would never be taken from her. I checked in periodically, pleased to see her thriving. Then the first complaint arrived at my office. The State Bar Association forwarded a formal ethics complaint alleging I had manufactured evidence in Gracie's case. The complainant remained anonymous, but the writing style and specific details pointed directly to Gertrude. Despite being held pending trial, she had apparently found ways to continue her campaign. The complaint accused me of. I spent hours preparing my response, gathering every document, email, and piece of evidence from the case. The complaint was baseless, but it would still require time, energy, and resources to defend. As I worked late into the evening assembling my defense, my phone buzzed with a text from Gracie. She was panicking. Her principal had called her into his office that afternoon to discuss concerning allegations about her fitness to teach. Someone had sent an anonymous letter to the school board claiming Gracie was mentally unstable, had abandoned her children multiple times, and posed a danger to her students. The letter included photos that appeared to show Gracie in various states of distress, though she couldn't. Hands shaking as she showed me the principal's notes from their meeting. The twins slept peacefully in their crib, unaware of the storm brewing around their mother once again. Over the next several days, the attacks escalated. Gracie's elderly parents received a package containing printed emails, supposedly from Gracie, confessing to thoughts of harming her children. The emails were sophisticated forgeries, but convincing enough to send her mother into hysterics. Her father called demanding answers, his voice thick with confusion and fear. Anonymous calls began coming to Gracie's home at all hours, sometimes silent, sometimes breathing. Occasional whispered voice saying the twins would be better off without her. She changed her number. Dead flowers appeared on her doorstep with notes about unfit mothers. I hired a private investigator to trace the harassment, though we both suspected the source. The investigator confirmed what we feared. While Gertrude herself remained in custody, she had enlisted help. Her personal assistant, a woman named Patricia whom I'd seen at the courthouse, was executing Gertrude's plans with disturbing efficiency. The school board scheduled a formal hearing to review Gracie's fitness to teach. I attended as her advocate, watching as board members reviewed the anonymous allegations with furrowed brows. Gracie sat beside me, maintaining her composure despite the tears threatening to spill. She presented character references from colleagues. The board voted to place her on administrative leave pending a full investigation. It was a blow, but not a fatal one. Gracie's principal pulled her aside afterward, assuring her he believed in her innocence but had to follow protocol. The lost income would hurt, especially with her husband still deployed, but we would fight this. More family members began receiving communications. Gracie's cousin called in tears after getting a letter claiming Gracie had stolen money from their grandmother's estate. Her aunt received photos of the twins with ominous messages about their safety. Each attack was carefully crafted to turn Gracie's support system against her, to isolate her just as Gertrude had done before. I documented everything meticulously, every call, every listen, building a pattern of harassment that we could present to authorities. But Gertrude was clever. Nothing could be definitively traced back to her, and Patricia always had alibis provided by other employees from Gertrude's company. The stress began affecting Gracie's health. She lost weight, dark circles forming under her eyes from sleepless nights spent checking on the twins every hour. Her postpartum depression, which had been improving, threatened to resurface under the constant pressure. I connected her with a therapist who specialized in harassment victims, someone who could help her process the trauma while we fought back legally. 3 weeks into the harassment campaign, Gracie's husband, Marcus, managed to secure emergency lift. Marcus arrived home to find his wife a shadow of herself, jumping at every phone ring and checking the locks obsessively. His presence provided immediate relief. Marcus was a stabilizing force, taking night shifts with the twins so Gracie could sleep, screening calls, and installing security cameras around their modest home. He accompanied her to therapy sessions and held her when the weight of it all became too much. But Gertrude's campaign adapted. New allegations surfaced claiming Marcus was violent, that he had abandoned his family for the military, that the twins showed signs of abuse. These lies were even more outrageous than the previous ones, but they still required responses, still demanded energy. The legal system moved slowly, while Gracie's life unraveled in real time. Each small victory was met with 2 new attacks from unexpected angles. The investigation into my ethics complaint continued, requiring detailed responses to increasingly absurd allegations. Gertrude had apparently spent her time in custody crafting elaborate theories about how I had orchestrated her downfall. She claimed I had planted evidence, bribed witnesses, and manipulated the court. The Bar Association investigator seemed skeptical, but they still had to follow procedure. Family relationships began fracturing under the pressure. Some relatives believed Gracie completely, rallying around her with fierce protection, exactly as Gertrude had intended. The investigator called me with disturbing news. Patricia had been meeting with several of Gracie's former college friends, spreading stories about mental instability dating back years. She carried doctored photos and fabricated social media posts, painting a picture of someone who had always been unfit for motherhood. I love how she has alibis from other employees. Like what? Did they all sign up for the Help Our Boss Destroy Her Sister from Jail club with matching t-shirts? And poor Marcus comes home from serving his country to find his house turned into a fortress with security cameras everywhere, probably thinking he left one war zone for another. 2 of these friends reached out to Gracie. The security cameras caught glimpses of figures in dark clothing, always careful to stay just out of clear view. We turned the footage over to police, but without faces or license plates, they could do little beyond increasing patrols in the neighborhood. The harassment expanded to Marcus's military connections. His unit received anonymous reports about domestic violence and child endangerment. His commanding officer thankfully recognized the campaign for what it was and stood by Marcus. But the allegations still went into his file, still required investigation by military police. I worked with Gracie to compile evidence of the systematic harassment. We created timelines, cross-referenced incidents, and built all receiving payments from accounts linked to Gertrude's company. Child Protective Services arrived at Gracie's door one morning, responding to multiple anonymous reports. The social worker seemed sympathetic but explained she had to follow protocol. She inspected the home, interviewed both parents, and observed their interactions with the twins. The visit went well, with the worker noting the obvious love and care in the household. But the very fact of the investigation added another layer of stress. Gracie's teaching colleagues organized a support campaign. They wrote letters to the school board defending her character and professionalism. Parents of her students started a petition demanding her reinstatement. The groundswell of support. She approached one of Gracie's cousins at a coffee shop, not realizing the cousin was recording their conversation on her phone. Patricia offered money for damaging information about Gracie, claiming she was conducting research for a book about postpartum psychosis. The cousin immediately brought the recording to us. Armed with this evidence, I pushed for criminal charges against Patricia. The prosecutor agreed to investigate, though warned it might take time to build a solid case. Meanwhile, the harassment continued, though Patricia became more careful after learning about the recording. Gracie's parents, who had initially stayed neutral, finally chose a side. They visited Gracie, appalled by what their elder daughter had orchestrated. Their testimony would prove valuable if we could bring criminal charges. The twins, now crawling and babbling, remained blissfully unaware of the chaos surrounding them. Gracie found strength in their innocent smiles and reaching arms. She established strict routines to maintain normalcy for them, even as her own world felt increasingly unstable. I discovered Patricia had been recruiting others to help with the harassment. She found people through online forums offering small payments for simple tasks like making anonymous calls or leaving packages. Most participants didn't know the full scope of what they were involved in, thinking they were pranking someone who deserved it. The school board investigation dragged on. Gracie and anonymous allegations, however baseless, required thorough examination. Marcus's presence continued to be a stabilizing force, but the strain showed on him too. He struggled with guilt about his deployment, wondering if his absence had made Gracie more vulnerable. I reminded them both that Gertrude had planned this long before Marcus left, that his service wasn't to blame for his sister-in-law's actions. New tactics emerged. Gracie's credit reports showed inquiries from loan companies she'd never contacted. Someone had attempted to open credit cards in her name, though fortunately the applications were flagged as potentially fraudulent. We added identity theft to our growing list of crimes to report. The therapist working with Gracie experienced panic attacks when the phone rang and struggled with intrusive thoughts about losing the twins. The therapist recommended increased sessions and possibly medication, though Gracie worried about any documentation that could be twisted against her. I coordinated with other lawyers who'd faced similar harassment campaigns. They shared strategies for protecting clients and building cases against orchestrated attacks. One suggested hiring a reputation management firm to combat the online aspects of the smear campaign, which had begun appearing on social media and anonymous forums. Patricia's network grew bolder. Gracie found her car vandalized with scratches spelling out cruel messages. Marcus caught someone trying to missed them immediately. The investigator made a breakthrough. He traced payments from Gertrude's company accounts to a total of 12 individuals involved in various aspects of the harassment. The money trail was complex, routed through multiple accounts, but it established a clear pattern of paid persecution. Gracie's extended family began taking sides more definitively. Those who supported her formed a protective circle, offering babysitting, meal deliveries, and emotional support. Those who doubted her quietly distanced themselves, adding to her sense of isolation and betrayal. The Bar Association finally concluded their investigation into my ethics complaint, finding it completely without merit. They noted that, but the months of defending myself had taken time and energy away from helping Gracie. Marcus intercepted a package addressed to Gracie containing disturbing photoshopped images of the twins. The psychological warfare was escalating, designed to trigger her maternal fears and protective instincts. We added it to our evidence collection, though Gracie couldn't bring herself to look at the images. The prosecutor assigned to investigate Patricia finally took action. She was arrested on charges of harassment, stalking, and conspiracy. Her bail was set high enough to keep her in custody temporarily, providing a brief respite from the daily attacks. But we knew Gertrude would simply recruit others to continue her campaign. The board seemed swayed by the support, but bureaucratic procedures required them to wait for the final investigative report before making a decision. The twins celebrated their first birthday during this chaos. Gracie insisted on a small party, determined to create happy memories despite everything. Watching her children smash cake and giggle, she found moments of pure joy that reminded her what she was fighting for. Patricia's arrest led to others coming forward. Several people she'd recruited realized they'd been manipulated and offered to testify about her methods. They described how she presented Gracie as a danger to children, showing them carefully edited photos and fabricated evidence to justify that civil action could provide faster relief and financial compensation for the damage done. The company's lawyers immediately moved to distance the corporation from Patricia's actions, claiming she acted independently. Gertrude, still awaiting trial for the original custody scheme, somehow continued orchestrating attacks from jail. Phone records showed she'd been in regular contact with multiple individuals, though the conversations were carefully coded. The prosecutor added witness tampering and obstruction charges to her case. The financial strain on Gracie and Marcus intensified. Legal fees, therapy costs, security measures, and lost income from her suspension created mounting pressure. A breakthrough came when one of Gertrude's fertility clinic employees approached me. She'd witnessed Gertrude planning the harassment campaign before her arrest, discussing contingency plans if the custody scheme failed. The employee had stayed silent out of fear but couldn't watch Gracie suffer any longer. This testimony proved crucial. It established premeditation and showed Gertrude had prepared for exactly this scenario. The prosecutor used it to argue for denying Gertrude bail when it came up for review, successfully keeping her incarcerated while awaiting trial. The school board finally reached their decision. After months of investigation, they found no merit to the anonymous allegations and voted to reinstate Gracie immediately. Their innocent enthusiasm helped heal some of the wounds from the ordeal. But the attacks didn't stop entirely. With Patricia in custody and Gertrude's communications restricted, the harassment became less coordinated but didn't disappear. Occasional anonymous letters still arrived. Strange cars still drove slowly past their house. The fear remained, even as its sources diminished. I worked with prosecutors to build comprehensive cases against all identified participants. Some accepted plea deals, testifying about their recruitment and payments. Others maintained innocence, claiming they'd acted independently out of concern for the children. The legal process would take months more to fully resolve. She learned to accept that not all relationships could be salvaged, focusing instead on those who'd stood by her. The twins thrived despite the chaos around them. They took their first steps, spoke their first words, and developed distinct personalities. Gracie documented every milestone, determined to prove she was the devoted mother she'd always been, not the monster Gertrude had tried to paint. Marcus received orders for his next deployment, but successfully appealed for deferment given the family circumstances. The military showed understanding of their situation, granting him extended time to ensure his family's stability before returning to service. As Patricia's these documents provided a roadmap of the entire campaign, implicating dozens of participants in various roles. The civil suits progressed slowly but steadily. Gertrude's company, facing potential liability, offered a settlement to avoid trial. I advised Gracie to consider it carefully. The money would help offset their losses and provide security, but accepting might limit their ability to pursue further action. The twins having their first birthday party in the middle of all this drama is perfect timing. Nothing says, "We're fine, everything's fine," like babies destroying cake while their aunt sits in jail plotting from behind bars like some discount villain who can't even afford it. The therapist praised her resilience while acknowledging the long road to full recovery ahead. The investigator discovered something that changed everything. Patricia had been using a second phone registered to a fake name, and the digital forensics expert managed to recover deleted messages between her and Gertrude. The conversations revealed not just the harassment campaign, but something far more sinister. Gertrude had been planning to have someone snatch the twins during one of Gracie's panic attacks. I immediately took this evidence to the prosecutor. Within hours, additional charges were filed against both Gertrude and Patricia for conspiracy to commit kidnapping. The judge revoked Marcus installed additional security measures around their home. Motion-activated lights covered every angle of the property. He changed all the locks and added reinforced deadbolts. The twins' bedroom windows received special locks that could only be opened from inside. He took leave from his military duties to stay home full-time, his commanding officer granting an indefinite family emergency extension. The harassment network began collapsing. Without Patricia coordinating and Gertrude unable to communicate freely, the paid participants scattered. Several approached me directly, offering information in exchange for leniency. They revealed the full scope of the operation. Fake social media. They hired their own attorney and filed a restraining order against their elder daughter, publicly choosing Gracie's side. Her mother gave a deposition describing Gertrude's lifelong pattern of manipulation and control. Her father provided financial records showing how Gertrude had tried to buy their loyalty over the years. Their testimony would prove valuable if we could bring criminal charges. The twins, now crawling and babbling, remained blissfully unaware of the chaos surrounding them. Gracie found strength in their innocent smiles and reaching arms. She established strict routines to maintain normalcy for them, even as her own world felt increasingly unstable. I discovered Patricia had been recruiting others to help with the harassment. She found most participants didn't know the full scope of what they were involved in, thinking they were pranking someone who deserved it. The school board investigation dragged on. Gracie's principal privately expressed frustration with the process, believing she should be reinstated immediately. But bureaucracy moved at its own pace, and anonymous allegations, however baseless, required thorough examination. Marcus's presence continued to be a stabilizing force, but the strain showed on him too. He struggled with guilt about his deployment, wondering if his absence had made Gracie more vulnerable. I reminded them both that Gertrude had planned this long before Marcus left, that his service wasn't to blame for his sin. Someone had attempted to open credit cards in her name, though fortunately, the applications were flagged as potentially fraudulent. We added identity theft to our growing list of crimes to report. The therapist working with Gracie noted concerning signs. The constant stress was triggering symptoms similar to PTSD. Gracie, startled at unexpected noises, experienced panic attacks when the phone rang, and struggled with intrusive thoughts about losing the twins. The therapist recommended increased sessions and possibly medication, though Gracie worried about any documentation that could be twisted against her. I coordinated with other lawyers who'd faced similar, which had begun appearing on social media and anonymous forums. Patricia's network grew bolder. Gracie found her car vandalized with scratches spelling out cruel messages. Marcus caught someone trying to access their mailbox late at night. The twins' daycare received calls questioning the safety of the children, though the director, familiar with the family, dismissed them immediately. The investigator made a breakthrough. He traced payments from Gertrude's company accounts to a total of 12 individuals involved in various aspects of the harassment. The money trail was complex, routed through multiple accounts, but it established a clear pattern of paid persecution. Gracie's extended family, those who doubted her quietly distanced themselves, adding to her sense of isolation and betrayal. The Bar Association finally concluded their investigation into my ethics complaint, finding it completely without merit. They noted the complaint appeared to be retaliatory and referred it to prosecutors as potential evidence of continued harassment. It was a victory, but the months of defending myself had taken time and energy away from helping Gracie. Marcus intercepted a package addressed to Gracie containing disturbing photoshopped images of the twins. The psychological warfare was escalating, designed to trigger her maternal fears and protective instincts. We added it to our evidence and conspiracy. Her bail was set high enough to keep her in custody temporarily, providing a brief respite from the daily attacks. But we knew Gertrude would simply recruit others to continue her campaign. Gracie's school board hearing finally arrived. She presented her case with dignity, surrounded by colleagues and parents who testified to her excellence as a teacher. The board seemed swayed by the support, but bureaucratic procedures required them to wait for the final investigative report before making a decision. The twins celebrated their first birthday during this chaos. Gracie insisted on a small party, determined to create happy memories despite everything. Watching her children smash cake and giggle, she found several people she'd recruited realized they'd been manipulated and offered to testify about her methods. They described how she presented Gracie as a danger to children, showing them carefully edited photos and fabricated evidence to justify their participation. I filed civil suits against Patricia and Gertrude's company for the harassment campaign. While criminal charges were important, civil action could provide faster relief and financial compensation for the damage done. The company's lawyers immediately moved to distance the corporation from Patricia's actions, claiming she acted independently. Gertrude, still awaiting trial for the original custody scheme, somehow continued orchestrating attacks from jail. The prosecutor added witness tampering and obstruction charges to her case. The financial strain on Gracie and Marcus intensified. Legal fees, therapy costs, security measures, and lost income from her suspension created mounting pressure. Gracie's parents helped where they could, as did Marcus's family, but the couple struggled to make ends meet while fighting on multiple fronts. A breakthrough came when one of Gertrude's fertility clinic employees approached me. She'd witnessed Gertrude planning the harassment campaign before her arrest, discussing contingency plans if the custody scheme failed. The employee had stayed silent out of fear but couldn't watch Gracie suffer any longer. This testimony proved crucial. It established premeditation, successfully keeping her incarcerated while awaiting trial. The school board finally reached their decision. After months of investigation, they found no merit to the anonymous allegations and voted to reinstate Gracie immediately. She returned to her classroom exactly as she'd left it, her students rushing to hug her legs. I worked with the prosecutor to consolidate all charges. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic persecution designed to destroy Gracie's life and steal her children. We had financial records, digital communications, witness testimony, and Patricia's own detailed notes documenting every attack. Marcus's military unit rallied around him. His commanding officer personally called to assure him that his record would reflect the truth of the situation, not the false allegations. The twins began walking, taking tentative steps between their parents. Gracie captured every moment on video, building a library of memories that proved the loving home she provided. Their first words were "Mama" and "Dada," spoken within days of each other, bringing tears of joy after months of fear. Gertrude's company faced internal turmoil. Board members, learning about her use of company resources for the harassment campaign, voted to terminate her employment and pursue recovery of misused funds. Her professional reputation crumbled as she testified about Gertrude's detailed instructions, the payment structure, and the recruitment of others. Her testimony revealed that Gertrude had been planning this for years, long before the twins were even born. Family members who had doubted Gracie came forward with apologies. Her cousin organized a family gathering to show support, bringing together relatives who had been divided by Gertrude's lies. They shared stories of their own encounters with Gertrude's manipulation over the years, finally seeing the pattern clearly. I filed additional civil suits on Gracie's behalf. Beyond seeking damages from Gertrude and her company, we pursued claims against every identified participant in the harassment. Most settled quickly. The prosecutor offered Gertrude a plea deal, 15 years in prison with possibility of parole after 10. She refused, insisting on trial and maintaining her innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Her attorney tried various defense strategies, but none could explain away the documented conspiracy. Gracie's therapy sessions focused on reclaiming her sense of safety. She practiced breathing exercises for the panic attacks and developed strategies for managing triggers. The therapist noted significant improvement as the external threats diminished and Gracie's support system strengthened. Marcus received permanent reassignment to a local military installation. His superiors recognized the exceptional. The daycare center where the twins spent their days implemented new security protocols. The director, having witnessed the harassment attempts, installed cameras and required photo identification for anyone picking up children. Other parents appreciated the increased safety measures. Gertrude's trial lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution presented a methodical case showing premeditation, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. I testified about discovering the adoption scheme, and Gracie bravely took the stand to describe the impact on her family. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdict came down on a Thursday afternoon, guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Gertrude showed no emotion as officers led her away. Patricia received 5 years in prison as part of her plea agreement. Others involved in the harassment received probation and community service, along with restraining orders preventing any contact with Gracie's family. The network that had terrorized them for months was finally dismantled completely. The civil settlements provided enough money for Gracie and Marcus to pay off their debts and establish college funds for the twins. They kept the amounts modest, seeking justice rather than windfall profits. The financial security allowed them to focus on healing rather than survival. Gracie returned to teaching with renewed passion. Her students, the normalcy she had fought so hard to preserve. The extended family dynamics shifted permanently. Those who had supported Gracie formed closer bonds, while those who had doubted her maintained polite but distant relationships. Gertrude's parents visited regularly, building the grandparent relationship that Gertrude's actions had nearly destroyed. Marcus transformed their spare bedroom into a home office where he could work on military administrative duties while being present for his family. The arrangement allowed him to continue serving while prioritizing his role as husband and father. His presence provided the stability Gracie needed to fully heal. The twins flourished in their secure environment. They developed distinct personalities, one outgoing. Every milestone was celebrated without the shadow of potential loss. I closed Gracie's file with mixed emotions. The case had consumed over a year of intense work, but seeing her family thriving made every late night worthwhile. She sent me photos of the twins on their second birthday, their faces covered in chocolate cake, surrounded by family who had chosen love over manipulation. The prosecutor pursued additional charges against others who had participated in the harassment. Most pled guilty to minor charges, receiving probation and fines. The message was clear. Orchestrated campaigns to destroy someone's life would face serious consequences. Gracie's school recognized her resilience with the standing ovation from parents and fellow teachers marked her complete reintegration into the community Gertrude had tried to turn against her. Marcus's military unit honored him for balancing service with extraordinary family challenges. His story became an informal case study in supporting service members facing domestic crises. He used his experience to advocate for better family support resources within the military structure. The twins started preschool at age 3, confident and well-adjusted children. Gracie walked them to their classroom that first day without fear, knowing the threats were behind bars or bound by restraining orders. Their teachers reported they were social, happy children. She would be eligible for parole in 15 years, but her life as she knew it was over. Her pharmaceutical license was revoked, her assets liquidated to pay civil judgments. The family found their new normal. Marcus completed his military commitment while working locally. Gracie taught full-time, loving her work with young children. The twins grew surrounded by love and security, unaware of how close they'd come to being stolen. Occasional therapy sessions helped process residual trauma, but life moved forward. Looking at the twins playing in their backyard, Gracie felt profound gratitude. They'd survived an orchestrated campaign designed to destroy their family. The scars remained, the war was over, and her family was whole. 25 years in prison, wow, well deserved. That is all for this story. If you want to see more, please subscribe.